Welcome to Building While Flying, a Sasha Group podcast where we interview business leaders about how they tackle challenges, stay resilient, and navigate ever-changing skies. Welcome to Building While Flying. My guests today are Victoria Kennedy and Isabel Seal, co-founders of Seed to Harvest Ventures. Seed to Harvest Ventures is a pre-seed and seed stage fund investing in software companies built by women-identified founders of color. Victoria and Isabel, welcome to Building While Flying. So you're both former product design leaders. You were from the world of early stage startups, and you've taken that knowledge to really launching what is now a VC fund. But can you give us a little bit more about who you both are, a little bit of a potted history of how you met one another and decided to go ahead and begin the world of venture capital and begin a fund of your own?
Yeah, I think a good overview is, so Isabel has a really great product design background, and she's mostly been at like B2B companies, really from that product market fit to scale phase. My background's in product management, and I love the beginning. So I've been mostly in the idea to product market fit across a couple different industries. And we actually met 6 years ago at a company called Hustle, which was the first peer-to-peer texting application. We're sorry that you get all those texts now, but at the time it was amazing. And
it is you that we have to blame for opening a whole new marketing channel.
Yeah. We millions of messages. Some of it was amazing, like working with Stacey Abrams was a client, and when things were happening in Georgia with the voter boxes, like we were the people texting people, here's your location, here's the fact that you can actually still vote. It got extended for 3 hours in a way that you can't do via email or anything else. So it was cool. And then It got abused, but we tried. But like we built out the enterprise product together, and we built out a New York office together, and just really worked super well together, had really like similarly weird backgrounds in terms of how we grew up, but also just like how we thought about tech and like how we think about building teams and building product. And so it was really a great team for us to do as like design and product leaders. And yeah, I'll let Isabel tell more about her life.
Yeah, background. I started in engineering and design. Engineering was more of a forcing function because when I started in the industry, a lot of startups couldn't justify a full-time designer. So it was like learn how to code or get fired situation. But that really deeply informed and more of a systems designer and systems architect. And having that technical background has really informed how I approach design and tying that in with business value and working with product. Like Victoria said, I've been on that cleanup crew where a lot of early stage companies have to cut corners to get going quickly, but it can come back to haunt you a little bit when you do have an opportunity to grow. And yeah, since working with Victoria 6 years ago, we've always kept in touch, pushed each other personally, professionally. And so when she started exploring venture, I was along for the ride as a sounding board, taking notes, and I've always wanted to work with Victoria again. You say that a lot when you find someone that you love working with. Oh, I hope we can work together again. And just didn't want to pass up the opportunity to do that when Seed to Harvest came up.
That's super exciting. I love the idea of like professional kismet. And so often like it's the story of two great founders. So it's great that you found one another. You kicked off Seed to Harvest, and it's pretty early stage still, right? As a fund. I know you're planning on probably making your first investments into like in 2023. Yeah. But before we dive into just some of the detail on that, on your site, you have that organizing statement, if you will, of we believe that companies built by and for women of color are the new unicorns. Can you speak a bit about that kind of thesis and what sits behind where you've decided to focus on for this fund?
Yeah. So what's been really interesting is as a product manager, you're always looking for problem statements and opportunity. Like where can I align what I'm seeing with the type of customers and problems we're looking to solve? Like where can I find something that's like a valuable business with a big enough market? And so when we've been thinking a lot about like the issues we've seen in tech, it was really around everyone's focused on one type of founder and like the problem statements that they choose to care about. And that usually tends to be literally just like men, usually white men from Stanford and MIT and Harvard if you're feeling frisky, right? And I went to Stanford. I love Stanford. It's great, but not everyone needs to come from Stanford. Like you need variety in order to build interesting, innovative things that'll be long lasting. And something that we felt and then later got a lot more research on was like just the lack of innovation in tech, which in fact everyone's pattern matching to the same type of founders. And like the same type of check writers are writing those checks to those founders. And so when we thought about like kind of root causes, really like, how do you change like who gets to be a founder who writes the check to really capitalize on the innovation that tech can actually create? So the research that started this was really around who are the emerging founders and where's the market going? So when we think about the state of founders now, women of color are the largest group of entrepreneurs that are happening, which is great. And there's a lot of proof that women, like women in general, tend to deliver 35% higher ROI on investment dollars, 78 cents on the dollar versus 31 cents on the dollar for men. And all male teams are basically an overutilized and overvalued asset and everyone's focused on them. And we're like, okay, there's opportunity in women, specifically women of color right now. But what we're really focused on is in the future, when you think about the types of companies that people want to work at and the types of companies that we think will succeed, one, they usually building for like the big consumer, like there's a big notion around, like Samsung's really big on the next billion consumers, which looks to be women of color, both globally in the US over the next decade. And right now, the tech ecosystem really is focused on founders and types of problems that don't really address the next billion consumers, which not just influences consumer products, but how people work, what businesses look for, how B2B companies relate to each other. And all of that right now is being missed. And so we see a huge opportunity in the future to really be the go-to fund for that and really be like kind of part of that changing ecosystem.
That's awesome. And I feel like we see some of these stats popping, right, or really discouraging stats popping up in the headlines. I feel like the beginning of this year, like that 2% number has been chasing female founders around for like way too many years at this point. And I think,
yes,
I think at the beginning of this year, it was that female founders just raised only 2%, and not even beginning to talk about women of color founders. Yeah. Female founders of all colors raised just 2% of venture capital in 2021, which was less than the year prior. What do you think it is that's stopping the rest of the industry from tapping into this? And do you think as well, I mean, I'm coming off the back of the very highly publicized bromance with SBF and how much money was thrown into crypto and the kind of like shiny object of the eccentric young white founder. Do you think some of these things are a signal that maybe you guys are at the beginning of a wave and there's more to come in the positive?
Yeah.
There's definitely more to come. When you think about venture in and of itself, isn't it fairly recent since the 40s? Like one of the primary models and how the system is created and how people think about investing in companies is still fairly recent in history. It's no wonder that like the system, especially in the United States, is the way that it is. What we've found is challenging that playbook and trying to expect a different outcome. You can't use the same playbook, but you still need to find the principles that allow you to break in and advance. So that's definitely one facet to the problem. And by problem, like we really think about it more of an opportunity. Like it gives us an edge, and it's really just looking where others haven't, whether it's they already have their pipelines in place or their systems in place or their sourcing. My approach, I don't want to speak for Victoria, but my approach isn't to change everyone else's mind. It's where can we find success where no one else is? And where do we deeply believe the opportunity is?
Yeah. And I think something we talked about that's actually been a change in even like how we talk about the fund and how we approached any like materials like our pitch deck. When we originally started talking about this, we initially had this deck where we had the 2%, all the stats that people know that were really like the lacking metrics and it didn't really reflect what we thought was a real opportunity. So we changed the metrics we started talking about. It's not that women of color are getting a small amount of VC funding, is that women of color deliver greater investment.
Higher rate of return, yeah.
They're building companies that diverse companies, both gender and ethnicity wise, tend to perform better when you think about the diversity makeup of the executive team. And it does even more so for ethnicity than for gender. And so we're getting kind of the intersection of two really positive signals for success for founders and some of our companies long term that most people are ignoring. What's interesting, and so that was a really big change for us because we don't want to talk to women of color about women of color as if they're not capable. Like this is something we really care about. A lot of times, intentionally or unintentionally, I think people, because there's all these like negative associations, not just with women of color, but women in general, in terms of what's lacking. When you say, oh, like we're focused on women of color, they're like, oh, they must need so much help, or that's really nice. And it's like, no, this is an opportunity. Like this is an unprecedented financial opportunity that we're talking about. And like that we're going after. And a lot of people don't see it that way, which I think prevents them from truly investing in women of color. And that narrative, actually thinking, is like more damaging because the data's there. Like the data's there to see this is a great opportunity. But the narratives that people are used to hearing and just like the beliefs and the stories that we tell about women of color are always like usually so sad that it's like, so it's hard for people to be like, oh, the sad people talk about all the time. Like those people we should invest in. And it's infuriating, but a great opportunity for us. And we talk about it like that.
It's funny because almost like meta, it's turning the entire principles of all of the decisions that one would take when talking to a prospective company about like evaluating whether they're a good investment and applying it to the state of venture capital. Like here is a giant under-recognized opportunity and we're going to go over there instead of playing this overcrowded pond over here.
We joke though, because it feels so obvious to us. And again, we have the advantage because we've started a fund with that purpose in mind. But if you were to have an existing fund, to change that, you're changing the people who've invested in you, the way that you go about sourcing, how you interact with people. I don't think it's a flip of a switch, but when we talk about it, a lot of folks still, I mean, even when we bring in our product expertise, is it's, oh, do women of color need more help? No, like some funds are focused on marketing or PR, or later stage funds have M&A experts. Like we have that product expertise, and we use that as an edge as investors and to ensure the success of early stage companies. So it's just interesting to see really how it's perceived, given, like Victoria said, just the social narrative that we have, media, really everywhere around us.
Yeah. It's almost the default where everyone flips into, oh, it's this news story that we're playing into.
Yes. And I think what's interesting though about at least what we're seeing the changes of in the VC ecosystem part, at least, is so LPs are the people who fund funds, VC funds. They can be family offices, high net worth individuals. They can be big pensions and foundations. It all depends on your size and all these different myriad factors can be interesting or boring depending on who you are. But what I think is interesting from that standpoint, it used to be where basically people would pitch a VC fund and they would be like, hey, I have a network. I went to Stanford and I know a bunch of founders there. Or I was like an employee at Google for a while, so I know all the Google people who are going to do a fund. And that's how you got in, is say what kind of exclusive network you have access to and then like put a general idea of what you're investing together and call it a day. But now with the proliferation of so many VC funds, what's interesting now is like the way people used to differentiate themselves isn't applicable anymore, because there's so many funds that like, if all of you are networked at Stanford and Harvard, then who cares?
Where's your brand differentiation, mate?
Yeah. And I think for us, it was a real turning point. We were hid a little bit from like our product and design, our operator expertise at the beginning, because like the normal VC background is I have a finance background or I worked at a big name VC and now I'm like spinning out of that and starting my own fund. So people could like pattern match you to what existing works. Like we don't match that pattern. At first we were kind of like, oh, I don't know. But what we found that not only is it differentiated with founders who are like, I don't want just money on my cap table. I want VCs who are mission aligned. I want VCs who can be a true value add to me, which is like our tool for getting in, right? If we invested in just fintech or something else, like the product and design skills would still be the tool we use to get in with founders and to de-risk our investments. What's interesting now is like, we're really leaning into that and seeing really good positive feedback from LPs because it is truly differentiated in the approach. I think what's funny in terms of that market perspective is being focused on women of color. A lot of times people are like, oh, there's a lot of diversity funds. And no one says about fintech or AI funds.
Right.
Those, and sometimes they're differentiated, but a lot of times they're just like, I have a background in AI and we're going to do this fund, and people may or may not give them money. But even when we think about it from being a quote unquote diversity fund perspective, even though we're not like an impact fund, like a lot of funds that focus on like women founders tend to focus on white women, and a lot of funds that focus on underrepresented tend to focus on men of color, and women of color largely still aren't the majority of their investments are where they're focused. But again, that's where you get that like double kind of plus about gender diversity and ethnic diversity that really propels businesses forward and is like what's reflective of the future that all founders really need to build for, but women of color are on the best seat and opportunity to build for that. And it's really fun because we're like, it feels so clear, but in this changing demographics, it's cool because I think we're really well positioned to be unique, but then you're still fighting that uniqueness battle too, where it's like everyone wants you to be unique, but not too unique that they have to learn.
It's like there's an education component that has to come with our storytelling sometimes.
Totally get that. And the frustration in some ways of being on the crest of a wave that will be utterly normalized in a period of time, and you'll just have been the first movers. Let's talk a bit about that product and design background that you both bring to this, because I think exactly to your point, so much of traditional VC fund members will bring a whole load of that kind of experience of what investing is like and how to get your pitch deck in a good place and all the kind of storytelling behind it, but maybe don't have some of that deeper, like what it is to launch a product that actually works in market time and time again. Talk about how that's influenced how you're thinking of running this fund and also what you sort of bring to the table when you begin these conversations with both funders and founders.
Yeah. In terms of how we evaluate, I'm trying to think where to start. So
let's start first with, talk about how your project management, systems design, systems architecture, product experience has influenced how you are shaping this fund. What sits behind the philosophies of it?
Oh man, it really shapes everything. It shapes from
it's like how we could do this because we're like, how do you make this basically into launching a product is basically what we've done.
Yeah. So it's so ingrained into our approach, how we communicate and work together. So from that interpersonal level, how we set our weeks, how we set our targets.
We have a Kanban board.
Yeah, we really live and breathe the product process because it is so ingrained in us. It's how we approach our working style in the fund. When it comes to looking at investments, we really take a look at the problem statement. And it's interesting because it sounds so much simpler than it is. But we look for founders who have a clear problem statement. For example, a lot of sometimes people had this idea in college of a company they wanted to start, but they haven't done that work. They try and retrofit a problem to a solution.
Right.
Versus, I have deep domain expertise on this. Not just maybe I've experienced it, but you've either had a career in the industry and seen an opportunity. We've talked to a founder who has a cybersecurity product that she's launching, and she spent 20 years being a consultant in the industry. So she has deep domain expertise that enables her to really like have an edge in that space. Another thing too is what we call product sense. And this is all in addition to the normal checklist of things that you'll find on Google. But product sense is really that willingness to test, to experiment, to learn, to iterate. So not being married to the solution, especially at the early stages in pre-seed and seed, the probability of your solution changing is extremely high. You don't have product market fit.
You're not iterating.
Exactly. You're iterating constantly. And so there is a really big difference between what would be more of a fixed mindset and not being able to like make those changes, keep pace, stay ahead. Like all of those are signals for us in terms of the propensity for success that founder and the team will have. As the founder, you're leading, you're the leader. So if you're not embodying that, that trickles down too, to whoever you have, no matter the talent. That's where culture comes in. That's not something that we index a lot on, but we have I have tons of experience on behavioral interviews and user research and cognitive psychology. And that is an angle that really comes in to how we're evaluating the companies that we look at.
I think also really shapes how we are as GPs and our flexibility. So some feedback we got recently is like that we take feedback really well, which is for us, we're like, okay, doesn't everyone? But no, because as like people who've worked as operators and built over 20 products between us, we're used to, my first job was in gaming, so I'm very used to negative feedback. I'm just like, people sometimes have anger issues and like sometimes people emote when it's actually has nothing to do with you, but we don't take it personally. We know that growth is the most important. Like that's a big thing that United says is this growth mindset. And don't sit around and wait to try something. You do the best you can. You have places to learn and get feedback, and you get better each and every time, whether that be conversations with LPs or how we run our like due diligence process with founders. We're constantly feeling like we're going to try this thing, have measurements of success, and get better. And that's what we look for in founders when we talk about product sense. Like we had a company that was actually pretty interesting, but when we talked to them, they had a beta of 100 users, and they've only had 100 users for a couple months now, and they hadn't grown any of their user base. And for us, that was a really big concern because we need founders that like, it's fine to start. Like we only
you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, we only invest in companies that have some type of traction, which is another interesting conversation we had with a potential LP. They were really, if you're going after women of color, couldn't having a traction requirement be a barrier to entry? And like, first off, Isabel was like, no, because we have excellent founders. But two, the idea of, I think people think of it as like more formalized. But what we're looking for is like, maybe you had 100 users 2 months ago, but when we talk to you again, and like now, you should be at 300. We need to see like growth and your ability to move fast, your ability to take information and make actual changes. That's what we really look for in founders, because that's all we know that builds great products. We know that's the skills you're going to need in order to make this successful long term. And that's like how we operate too.
I think too, at the core, it's transparency and vulnerability. We're evaluating a founder on a relationship that we'll have for a long time. And that's something that we look for in LPs too. There's a lot of parallels between those dynamics, but we had a company, for example, that did an intro call with us. And when they talked about their long-term vision, I had concerns about the direction they wanted to go in, because they would then be moving into direct competition with a very established market. I came onto the call the next time and proactively said, hey, I thought about this. This actually isn't where we want to go. This would position us better. And this is why we think that. So we expect things to change. But if you can't come to us and have those conversations and have a low ego about us asking questions and being curious about your thought process around there, that was incredibly good signal for us that if something is wrong, that founder will talk to us. We do a lot to try and create a very safe space for those types of conversations, but they have to happen. For us to be able to experience that, because it's not just, you don't really just have one shot. Like Victoria said, talk to you again in 3 weeks. What's the change there? And we're taking note of all of that. And so it's really the culmination of what that experience has been in getting to know the founders as well that gives a lot of signal.
It strikes me that, and I am speaking about this a little more from the outside looking in as a in the sort of insider experience of venture capital, but in an industry which is famed for kind of investing in founders who just are driven by an intense singular self-belief or the kind of cult of personality that drags an entire $1 billion investment behind them. Or, you know, as long as you can stay it with confidence, it's half the battle, and you've only got that one chance. I feel like all the things you're saying, firstly, seem eminently intuitive and sensible, but also kind of counter to that, like over glamorized Silicon Valley investor kind of cliche that has probably been perpetuated for the last decade or so. And back to your point, it is about transparency, vulnerability. It's about self-awareness, and it's about probably not that singular ego. It's about the openness to be able to build a story and take input, which seems really sensible as a thing to judge a founder against.
I think what's interesting, and like having the background that we have, like I did consulting for a number of years at Fortune 50 companies doing new products, as well as like super small companies doing it. And no one really likes change. So part of it is like the culture that evolved, and everyone's like, even if they don't like it, they're like, sometimes this is what we do, right? It's too hard to change. I have empathy for that. But it's funny. So, venture for a while has been growth at all costs. Then this year's recession hit. And now a lot of GPs are asking companies really be actually focused on profit and actually really have a good runway and not just burn cash and to grow at all costs. And I was having a conversation with an investor relations person at a crypto company, and he was just trying to get an understanding of the market from my perspective. And he was like, how are you thinking about, as a GP, and like, how are your portfolio companies or founders you're talking to thinking about this switch from like rapid growth at all costs to like now actually having to be profitable? And I was like, honestly, women of color have never really had the luxury of just assuming they'll get millions of dollars and burning money. So they're already prepped for this. Like they're already building profitable companies and they have this mindset.
Right.
But we aren't bringing all cost investor. So it's great for us. And he was just like, oh, okay, that's nice. It's great. We are in, I think, a position that's reflecting the changes that are happening in the market and in the culture of like VC, whether it's push or pull. But what I think is like very like kind of the driving force for us is really staying true to the things that we see in the market, even in finding the data supported, even though some of that we know is like still like signal rather than a definitive this is happening. But like, I think a big thing for us that we always have to think through is really continue to have the conviction and the confidence to be a little different, be okay with that, and know that just because everyone else is doing it that way, like we don't have to do it that way, but like it's something we struggle with.
There's another element too, where we've spent most of our careers working for CEOs that they can pull off the growth at all costs and not really being able to. And so that's just not.
You've seen the feet of clay.
Yeah. It ties back to that culture piece where like you're building teams that will churn through people that want to burn them out. And those companies don't succeed. And
they succeed temporarily.
Temporarily. Yeah. And the propensity for success though, long term, starts to diminish. And for us, an ulterior motive is really like investing in companies that we believe will be creating the tech ecosystem that we wanted to work in the last 15 years. And so that's very core to how we approach this as well. And it's really creating hopefully a fundamental change, even if it's on a small scale, for like sustainability, really. A company of a product of success, of revenue and profit. So that's definitely central to how we approach things.
I think that makes so much sense. You mentioned earlier on the concept of building for the next billion customers. And I think the flip side of that is what you're talking about here, which is like building for the employees and the people that are going to live and breathe and be your brand. Yeah. Like the writing is on the wall at this point about what the next generation of like developers or engineers or marketing people even want to be working on, let alone on the other side, what we want to buy and what digital environments we want to experience and what apps we want to have on our devices and all the rest of it.
Something too that's interesting is like, I think what's cool about being people who are operators, not even just like founders turned VCs are great, but like it's still different than being like an employee at a VC-backed company. Like leadership position, like it's still a different relationship. Last year I was talking to established VC and I was talking about the shift. It was like early in the whole great resignation conversation that I think largely got misguided. But the key thing was like people are no longer willing to work in environments where it's the CEO's ego at all costs and not whether or not this makes sense to their business or whether or not it churns their employees, whether or not they actually fulfill their diversity like ideals or they just say things and don't do it. Like all those things are no longer applicable. Like the new and even existing generation of tech workers is no longer working in that environment. And I was talking to this guy about it. I was like, I think culture is really important. We're missing something. And he was like, I don't know. I've seen a lot of assholes make money. And for me, it became really clear. Most GPs sit far away from the pain. It's like a really big thing. Go where the pain is. It's where you find your customers. But like most GPs don't have to have that. If you've come from a finance background, if you come from another VC, you haven't really worked in these companies and you're just getting filtered reports based off board meetings your founders are saying. But we've been in those companies and we know it's like, sure, you might be okay today, but in a year, if you're burning through employees, if this is like your fourth CTO, if this is your third head of product in a year, eventually it's going to hit the fan. And this company's going down. We have that perspective. So we know it's like, sure, asshole have previously made money, but I don't think that's true for the future. And we're not willing to take that risk.
It's like your understanding rather than the very binary, oh, this company really failed when they hit scale. They weren't able to scale. You have a little bit more of the operator's understanding of what the myriad reasons that point of scale was the drop off and was not a success story. Yeah, it's so interesting. So you talked a little bit, and I do think for those that, our listeners on the podcast side of things, we have a lot of early stage founders, startup and scale up enterprises. And I think it was so interesting to hear you talk about coming in with product sense, understanding like the true nuts and bolts of what it is that you're building, openness to input, willingness to adapt, evidence of traction, even if it's just small hints of it in the early stages. There's an ability to show growth and adaptability, and then obviously transparency. With all that in mind, and knowing that you're not yet fully yet investing as a fund, but I know you ladies are already starting to personally explore potential investments. Who's on your radar? Who are good examples of brands that might be, or companies that are playing into that or checking boxes on that front?
So I guess I'll talk about companies that are like maybe a little later in stages that might be interesting. So there's a company that we met. We do weekly office hours where we do 15 minutes of pre-product and design advice for any founder. It's usually like founders within our thesis, but we get men sometimes and they're cool. We help them still. But this woman came, she just closed her C round. It's a company called Breshna, and it's actually a gaming company that allows for people to make their own games. It's like an educational process. And what was really impressive about them, like one, my first job is in gaming. I've seen how great the mechanics of gaming can monetize products. And what I'm really interested in, and this is something we're exploring more about, talk about in terms of, we call them investment use cases, is about how gaming can be like applied to different industries outside of gaming. Not just,
oh my God, I don't get me started. I feel that there's so much connectivity.
but there's something where it's like gaming to help with like education. Actually, the first company we invested in together is actually a platform called Villy, where they really brought a gaming approach to that early expectant mom to like early childhood, where people could guess the gender of their baby and make bets on it, which like greatly increased the monetization of people, because when you add the idea of I get to win something now, people will spend more money. And so I'm really interested in that kind of approach. And I think for us, when we think about companies that we're invested in, we always look for people who are taking a different type of approach to the same problem set. Because at the end of the day, like there's a limited amount of problem sets that are venture backable, because there's a lot of problems, but do they scale to being a possible $1 billion company? Most not. And so there's a limited set, but like where we think we'll find like alpha, especially with our Better Women of Color, is really around a different perspective and applying different ways to solve those same problems in a way that actually works for the majority of customers, and not everyone else having to like retrofit into what some white dude in San Francisco wants.
I love that. I think it's so on brand as well to be thinking about it through the lens of different perspectives. And I've always been fascinated by how much innovation comes from bringing two seemingly wildly disparate ideas into one place. And you're kind of speaking to that. I feel like a kind of a founding story where you've got two people coming from like wildly different backgrounds or a mashup of concepts is often such a fascinating place to start.
Yeah. That's definitely like both of our backgrounds. It's like we both had upbringings where it was just all about really different perspectives, which like we both have found so valuable in how we approach like the world and our careers. But I also think what really drives like the innovation that we want to see and real opportunity that like for actually building like sustainable, but like financially viable, returnable for us as a venture fund companies, where I think before that narrative wasn't present. What's cool is I don't think we're the only fund with a narrative like that, but we're still like a unique place because that's not the majority culture. And so what's been cool for us is really finding other fund managers, whether they be emerging fund managers or more established, who really are like, there are other ways at the bare minimum to do this, but most likely probably better ways to do it. And so like, how can we scale this? How can we change like the fund model? Like there's people thinking about what's called like a redeemable warrant, so that companies aren't just giving large equity chunks away forever. Like
it's like a buyback method.
They can buy
There's
back.
a lot of alternatives to traditional VC fund modeling.
Yeah, that we find really cool. We're not doing it because we're like, our expertise in the product, less in finance, we hiring for that. like we have gotten
maybe
partners.
Fun too.
Yeah. But like we have like
you've got your plates full right now to like completely reimagine the funding model.
Yeah. Like he has 20 years of financial expertise that is guiding like what we're great at, and like we're giving like the cultural and like long-term context and vision to really make that financial model amazing. But with his finance background, not us pretending like we're going to get that 20 years somehow. But what I think is like super interesting is like, really, what are those different approaches? And I think for us, we're approaching it by really focusing on the type of founders we think are going to create those unicorn companies. And what are the different company like types? Like what are the opportunities in the market? Not necessarily a specific industry, but like we talked about gaming and we've talked about infrastructure, as well as a straight up nerd. So I don't know why I called you out first. It made me feel a little bit better.
Being that is cool nowadays. You're totally
B2B side. I mean, I have such deep domain expertise on SMBs and enterprise customers and clients from my background. And so yeah, I've like this secret hope that we're the go-to fund for like women of color building B2B companies in the industry.
Because like the cybersecurity company she was talking about as a Black woman, there's another company that we're really excited about that's in the like specialty healthcare space, and they're basically a platform to centralize payments and payment plans and quotes in that industry, which is like a very long-term industry. There's tons of different like specialty healthcare, but like this platform will bring them all in a centralized place. Also a Black woman. What is cool and like what we've talked about a lot is like we're getting, and it's something we talk about with the kind of quote unquote pipeline issue people see is I think sometimes people think women of color are building like ancillary companies, like it's only beauty or it's only like hair care, or it's only whatever, but it's like Black women are building cybersecurity companies, Black women are building financial tech companies, like Latinx women are building like community talent marketplaces. Like they're building all of these same types of, they're all in all of these industries, but their perspectives tend to be a lot more interesting in how they approach that problem. And they tend to actually have a more like profitability mindset, unfortunately, because like most times they know they're not going to get the funding.
Because they're in the frugal innovation business.
Yeah, that means they're solving real problems more and more. And that means that they are really set up for success when they do get to scale. And we can help de-risk that for us, that we would de-risk in any situation. But like our bet is take our skills and de-risk and focus on the type of founders that we think are going to create the most profitable companies in the next decade or so.
Exciting times, so much potential to come. I have 2 questions for you, and I know we're a little over time, but I'm gonna do them both. So with all this in mind, we've talked a bit about this huge opportunity area of women of color. We've talked about the idea of B2B, like startups, and like the less expected space. We've talked about new funding models and the idea of bringing in really fresh new perspectives to change the face of even how you define problems. If what you're doing succeeds, and hopefully others follow, what is the future of investment and the kind of the startup and scale up mix look like if you succeed in the next 10 years? Where do you hope that we will be?
Thinking out loud, a big thing for us both is like fundamental change. I think people talk a lot about change. People want change, but don't want to do anything differently. And a big tenet for us is we actually want change. We have to do things differently. And so for us, it would be not only that things are done differently, but it's not just like everyone starts doing things like our way. It's that everyone there's space to explore different options. And so like you still might have traditional venture in terms of invest in a bunch of companies, only 1 or 2 will make it. And like we have an expertise in this industry, and that's what we focus on at different stages. But there to be more like product-led companies or product-led funds for people to have more options for funding. Another thing we've been thinking about, just adding on, is like a lot of things are being funded like they're tech companies when they're not. And so a big instance of that is like Rework that people know about. Like it is at the core and how it was making money, a real estate play, but it was being funded like it was a scalable B2B play, which it is not. And you're seeing that a lot as like tech goes into multiple industries, like even like community, we have a big beef on, because if you're going to do community really well, it takes 4 to 5 years to really build that community and understand what it is.
And so, scaling community is different scaling than product. So
oh my gosh,
this is a lot.
Yeah.
But you end up having those big, let's say, mishaps that have happened because you're funding something, you're trying to force this financial model into a business model that doesn't fit for. And so I think if there's more options, there's less like pigeonhole forcing. Even if it's just like funding options, and maybe it doesn't directly fall under VC, but it's just like making all the funding options more accessible. That would be great. We talk about being really tactical partners with our founders. And so that means doing things like office hours. That means doing things like we don't do the product work for them, but it's like helping them think through, okay, you want to do this MVP. You're saying it'll take 6 months. This happened with one of our investments. They wanted to do an MVP of like the new like platform that they're building. And when we were first initially talking, she was talking about, she's like, it'll take 3 to 6 months. And we're people who have built MVPs in a month. And we're like, okay, is it going to take that long? What are you trying to do? And we reorient it back to the problem statements. Okay, what is it you're trying to solve in this MVP? What are the other solutions and ways you might do it? And as we talked through it, she's like, oh, actually, if we do the solution, it'll take us about a month and really solve that problem. And we don't have to do all this other stuff. And I was like, great. We didn't touch a thing. All we did was have the conversation and push her thinking. But she has enough of a background and focus on what her problem statement is and who her customer is to have that productive conversation.
Another thing long term in the industry, I'd love to just see there be more openness for funds to start that are a little different. We can help create a little more flexibility in the industry with people seeing a lot more variance and approach to VC. I think that would be a very exciting shift. Not that it all changes, but that it opens a little bit for differences in approach. And then also something we've talked about and what ties back to how people to refer to women of color and pipeline and them not being there is that I don't think VC has been an accessible option for women of color a lot, or they just don't know that they could get venture backed, or the people that would back them have a lot of bias. And so also just creating a lot more space. And we talk a lot about building ecosystems. So not only of founders and founders that we can connect together or to other funds, but also an ecosystem of other funds that it just creating and building out these connections where there is more of a space for founders to navigate even within our community.
It's fascinating because it's almost like making VC more entrepreneurial in and of itself to reflect that in which it invests is almost how I see what you're describing.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point because it's something else that I was thinking about too is even just getting started, something that's really frustrated me. There's been a longer history of people trying to force in diverse founders, and by diverse like non-white male founders from very specific schools. Like there's now a push to do that on the fund manager side with the idea that it will almost trickle down into the founders. But what's interesting is like the way you historically build a fund is really by having access to wealth. And so most people, like you get your first check, just like a founder, it's really hard to get your first check. As a VC, it's really hard to get your first check without it being just like, oh, I know a CEO who exited, or like my family office, or like I know people who have a couple $100,000 to a couple $1 million who I can get together to go to institutions like fund of funds or family offices where I don't know and say like, well, somebody's invested in me. Now you can just follow on, because most LPs, like most GPs, are reluctant to be the first check. But the problem is if you're actually looking to diversify the industry, you can't operate like that. You have to actually make changes to the system in order to facilitate new people coming in. And so what's happening now, I think, is it's still hard because like, even if you're getting more Black and brown fund managers of all genders and getting more like white women fund managers, there's still patterning
the money.
They're not getting the money.
It's still the same thing. You're looking for like
are still based off like what's already happened. So you end up getting like the diverse form of the same personality. Like they still probably went to the same schools, they probably still have the same background. They're just like look different, which in like some ways can still push things forward, right? But what really push things forward is not just like they look different, but they also have different backgrounds. There's different points of entry. Like you're not held to this, like especially wealth access, like given what's America historically, it's really hard if you don't break that up.
Oh, this is such a fascinating conversation. I feel like I need a follow-up just chat, which isn't the podcast interview.
I mean, it's fun. It's great for us to always, because none of our friends know what we do, so somebody has to talk to us.
Oh, it's fascinating. My last question is, what does 2023 look like? Seriously getting into business. What are you most excited about? What's your hot take on what 23 will be for Seed to Harvest Ventures? In the spirit of Gary.
That's a poignant question. We're doing strategy for 2023 last week, this week, next week. But I think it's really taking the signal that we've gotten this year. We've piloted founder events. We have established office hours. We've been hitting the conference circuit as speakers and really just building out our communities. And so I think it's just taking that. What we've talked a lot about is keep doing what we're doing. I feel really
more intentional.
Yes, but more intentional. We learned a lot this year, and now we're able to take like, great, what was valuable that we did? What do we want to repeat? What can be deprioritized? It's also just nice. Like we're a year in. Our first pitch deck was in January of 2022. And so
amazing.
It's nice just knowing like, we have a year under our belt. So next year, I think it's just taking in, being more intentional, being reflective and seeing what we've learned, where we do need to grow, and then where can we push on a little more. I'm excited to shift from fundraising into working with founders more full time. We've started doing a few deals already, and we just love the process. So it's getting to potentially, hopefully like transition once we close the fund, transition into that full time for a little bit and do what we love to do.
Yeah. And I think too, like specifics. So we piloted 2 founder events this year. Again, we're focused on like tactical help. So we basically took our 15-minute sessions and turned to like 45-minute sessions and tried that in Oakland, LA, met some amazing founders, connected with other amazing GPs. And we're looking to do that in more cities next year. And so we have about 6 to 7 cities. We're talking to GPs in those cities because we never want to just like parachute in places we don't know, and making sure that we really build in that ecosystem there, which is really great. We love honestly, the other fund managers that have been with us, specifically with other women fund managers, have just been like the backbone when I'm like, I don't know what we're doing. And like, how do you talk to LPs again? And I'm like, I think I fucked up. And like, I'm like sending voice notes and then people are like, you're fine. I was also crying on the floor yesterday, but everything's fine now. Like we have those people to like work with. And so it's like, how do we cultivate that community more? How do we like make sure we focus on the community? So we joined a couple different communities. Like I'm in Republic's VP program. We're in this awesome collective Dreams Are Doers, which is how we learned about this podcast opportunity. Like, really where the communities that we found success in, and not just like business outcome success, but like growth and personal success, because we're basically constantly growing now that we're doing this. And so I think for next year, like I'm really excited to take what we learn and turn into specifics, whether it's like how we approach our due diligence process and making that like more airtight. Also like really making things our own. Like we talked about this idea of doing like the use case we talked about. Because we're so focused on women of color, we didn't want to narrow ourselves with saying we only do fintech or marketplaces or whatever. And that's what people are used to, because it's like, where if you're a fintech planner, these 3 or 4 industries are common things like future of work, but those didn't feel authentic to us. But now they're like, okay, we can turn it to use cases, which is a very product thing.
We can just articulate it a little better instead of doing what is like the perceived right thing to do as you build them.
And we're like now starting to figure out how to translate how we think to how people traditionally think and meet in the middle, but in the way that allows context, which is really cool. Because I think before we were just like, I don't know, like, like we're like, we're just and now we're like, we know enough.
Winging it for a bit.
You're building while flying.
Exactly.
It sounds like you've had 10 months of like growth and excitement and a really interesting thesis, and also a really clear sense of how you're distinct as a fund, and also in terms of your focus. And that next year has awesome potential as you start to think more about working with founders. So hopefully we can revisit and talk more about some of the like active founders and companies that you're working with in maybe a year's time. Hear what happens going into 24. But it's been wonderful speaking to you both.
Thank you, Katie. It's been great.
Thanks for joining us for Building While Flying today. I hope you learned as much as we did. We'll meet you right back here next time for another flight.